Hello. Imagine Austin was adopted by City Council in 2012. It's our long range, comprehensive plan that serves as a roadmap guiding decision making for city leadership, both our mayor and city council, and also the city manager's office, as well as for our staff. Evelyn Mitchell is a principal planner in Austin Planning and a project lead for the ongoing update to Imagine Austin. John Zeanah is the owner and principal for his planning firm Interval, as well as the former chief development infrastructure officer for the city of Memphis, and before that, the director of planning for the city of Memphis. I'm Peter Partheymuller. I'm a strategic communications manager for the city of Austin, and I've been helping Evelyn and her team as they are working through the update process for Imagine Austin. Today, we're going to talk about John's new book and how we're working to update Imagine Austin and the lessons we've learned and John has learned through his work and what we can learn from his book. Could you tell us a bit about your book and what made you decide to write it?
Sure. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me on the show. Um, the book is Today's Comprehensive Plan: An Adaptive Approach, released on Princeton University Press and Island Press. As you said in my lead up, I've spent the last several years working for the city of Memphis in the planning department, in a couple of different roles of leadership over the last really 14 years. Um, One of the experiences that I got to have about 10 years ago was putting together the city's first comprehensive plan in nearly 40 years. The last time that prior to our comprehensive plan, Memphis 3.0, the last time that the city of Memphis had done a comprehensive plan was in 1981. And so in 2016, when we were starting the process of putting together the comprehensive plan, um, the city of Memphis actually didn't have a long range planning office. And so at that time, I was deputy director of planning and development, and I was put in charge of not only creating a process that would develop our first comprehensive plan in nearly 40 years, but to reestablish the office that would do it. And so there was a lot of um, things that I had to learn along the way, that my staff had to learn along the way, and um, through the process of putting together the plan and the process and um, uh, the steps that it took to get there. Um, I reached back into what I had learned as I went through planning school and um, in my early years as a practitioner. I read as many books as I could find, and found that a lot of the literature, a lot of the advice out there on doing a comprehensive plan in today's cities um, is just not adequate to the task that one undertakes. So
The books
I
that
wrote the
already
book.
were out there. And
Yeah,
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 okay.
that's right. So I wrote the book that I wish that I had been able to read before I started
Yeah.
uh, the comprehensive plan.
Um, yeah, Evelyn has talked about the book and how it's reassuring and she's felt much better and thankful for it. So I think it's accomplished that.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
definitely a book that I am very thankful to have now, but definitely wish I had when I started 2.5 years ago.
uh,
So some of those
yeah,
challenges
go ahead.
that
Sorry.
yeah, some of those challenges that we encountered that I think really frame what I wanted to convey in the book. Number one, we were planning a developed city. Traditional planning approaches, the traditional planning model is really oriented towards new places. Um, if you look at, there's a book that was written in the 1920s called The Master Plan. This was around the same time that a lot of the social sciences started to emerge, like urban planning, and there was new standard legislation that was being promulgated across the country around planning and zoning. And one of the things that was being promulgated during that time was for cities to do master planning. And so this book, The Master Plan, was actually written by one of the individuals who came up with the standard city planning and standard zoning acts. And the audience of his book that he continues to refer to is our pioneer community. And the methodology that he lays out in the master plan is very much oriented towards creating new places. That's not the situation that Austin or Memphis or many other cities in America is in now. We're in the situation now where when we're thinking about planning for our future, we're thinking about places that are already sometimes fully developed. Places that maybe doesn't have any greenfield remaining to be developed for new neighborhoods or new commercial districts. And so, there's a significant amount of, entrenched constituencies and land interests and property ownership interests and resident interests that are baked into those dynamics that make it a lot harder to use traditional approaches to, such a dynamic environment.
Because we're not working with a blank slate.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Not working with a blank slate, and you're working in areas where there are a lot of different values that are in conflict with one another. And so the comprehensive plan isn't just simply laying out land uses and, the transportation network on a blank canvas. It's working with those entrenched and conflicting and contested values in order to come up with what the plan or the approach to future growth, future development of the city is in a context like that.
In researching the book, you spoke with planners throughout the country, including Evelyn and Austin Planning Leadership. What were you looking to learn from them?
Yeah. So one of the main things that I wanted to learn from Austin and Oklahoma City and other cities that had done comprehensive plans around the same time that we did in Memphis, was how they approached dynamics like that, planning for a developed city, but also how they defined things like what comprehensive meant. That's such a tricky term because it makes it sound as if this is the plan to end all plans for your community, but there really has to be a defined scope and guardrails about not only what the plan is going to cover, but what it can accomplish. And so I wanted to understand how other cities approach that, how other cities approach change, and their discussion of what change looks like, how cities thought about implementation. Implementation is something that comprehensive plans often get criticized for not doing a good enough job of directing. And a lot of times that's because implementation is thought about at the end of the process as opposed to throughout the process. But all of that sort of leads into, thinking about the comprehensive plan not just as sort of formal moment in time, but a continuous process where, not only does the plan sort of extend beyond formal planning moments to shape change, but how the change that occurs in implementation shapes the plan, over time. And one of the things that stood out to me about Imagine Austin and the work that the city of Austin is doing comes from the priority programs that are in the comprehensive plan, not just as a thematic organizing element of the plan, but a structural component of the plan that was created to guide implementation and continuous planning. And I was happy to learn from Evelyn that the city is using priority programs as the foundation for the Imagine Austin update. And Evelyn, I'd love to hear you talk more about that decision and how that decision supports what you see as a more adaptive or flexible planning approach that you're taking in Austin, especially as you think about not only the update, but planning for implementation from the update.
Definitely, yeah. So the concept of priority programs was developed when Imagine Austin was adopted in 2012 through an iterative community process, speaking with community members, speaking with staff, and trying to identify these top, which are now top priorities that stakeholders have identified as the kind of lead priorities for the comprehensive plan to focus on. Um, and so with the 2012 version of Imagine Austin, it's used as one of a few organizational structures currently, and then also an implementation arm or strategy of the comprehensive plan itself. So the way that it was intended to be used, each priority program, so we have compact and connected, housing affordability, healthy Austin, to name a few. Each priority program is comprised of a number of different departments across the city, and each program has a what we call champion and co-champion leader that helps guide these work plans that were created, especially at the beginning, post-adoption of the comp plan, and to help focus on kind of the policies and actions that were identified in those work plans, which was something very unique for me as a planner coming into this role, because one of the biggest, I think, barriers for many planners across fields is how do we kind of break down silos and work interdisciplinary with our peers in other departments. And so, as we were kind of doing this pre-planning phase before launching the update itself, we wanted to focus on two things. One, how do we update the comprehensive plan, update Imagine Austin so that the structure is clear and concise? And we identified that using priority programs as an organizational structure um, is a great way to kind of one of a few ways to kind of streamline the comprehensive plan so it's easy to use, or just clearer to understand for city officials, elected and appointed officials, and community members itself. But then continuing the idea of the priority programs as implementation method. So through through identifying what we wanted to do with the update and beginning to think about implementation early on, we've identified a number of different things that we want to kind of check back in when kind of strengthening priorities and priority programs as an organizational structure and implementation arm. So one, checking in with Austin residents, different stakeholders, staff, identifying if those priorities that were listed back in 2012 still resonate with community members. And then also as we're developing an updated implementation strategy, seeing if we need to modify the role of their priority programs in some capacity. And then also ensuring that we're collaborating with staff to restructure the priority programs and kind of create systems. So we have a top down buy in, involvement, and participation kind of approach, but also, what is it, like a linear
Like
approach?
a leveling
Yeah, yeah.
sort of structure with the staff within the departments. Is that what you're talking?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, just really not solely leaning on other departments for implementation, but creating this kind of collaborative approach across the city when we're trying to implement this comprehensive plan, which we're viewing as kind of like a guiding framework for the city. And then I think, John, you mentioned a little bit earlier, but kind of really looking at the benefits of priority programs as a continuous planning kind of method. There are a lot of changes that happen in the city. Comprehensive planning is a long range document. So, kind of using these priority programs as a way to um, identify and incorporate and address those shifts that do happen throughout the duration of a comprehensive
Over
plan.
time from like the development and adoption of Imagine Austin in 2012 to where we are now, but also the years in between and the years ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So being able to check in with different staff and community members um, as well to see we have these long range visions. What are these kind of incremental or periodic updates or changes that we need to make in the short term, uh, considering market changes and other changes that happen in the city in order to reach those long range goals?
I think maybe a couple of examples of the priority programs might help, might be instructive. Like you mentioned, compact and connected. That was identified in the development of Imagine Austin 12, 13 years ago. That we want Austin to be a, a compact and connected city, neighborhoods connected to each other, and also like each area of town being self-sufficient. You don't have to go from Northwest Austin down to South Austin or into downtown to meet your needs. Like these areas can have it. And so to implement that vision, that idea, you work with transportation and public works, of course, about roads and transit and that sort of thing. But housing, like what kinds of housing do we have everywhere? But also maybe development because they development services because they involve permitting and other aspects of that. For healthy Austin, that's going to be awesome public health, but also maybe parks and recreation, or also again transportation. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and so one of the things that we're going to be, and I don't remember if I mentioned it earlier, but seeing if we, depending on any changes or shifts that happen with the priorities, do we have all the necessary departments within each of those priority programs?
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
yeah.
And John, you've talked about how implementation isn't just up to city departments. It's also external stakeholders because, we're not going to be building private housing or commercial buildings or that sort of thing. So we've got to think about how our vision can be implemented by external stakeholders and private actors. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just like you said, I mean, the um, the thing about the city's role, the public sector's role in planning is that while it takes the responsibility of putting together the vision and the plan on behalf or in concert with all the different stakeholders throughout the community, it really relies on so many of those stakeholders to be partners in implementation of the plan. And we planning puts such a greater emphasis now on community engagement than maybe it did, 50 years ago or so.
Yeah.
So certainly we've done a much better job as a profession recognizing the role of greater participation in shaping the plan. And so one of the things that I emphasize in the book is similarly, we need to recognize the importance of the community in shaping implementation of the plan too, and incorporating that into the process of not just engagement but plan making. The fact is that so many of the things that are in the comprehensive plan are not going to be uh, steps that are taken by the city itself to implement. The city creates the conditions that promote private development. The city creates the conditions that encourage, community involvement around advancing certain topics of the plan. And there are multiple types of implementation pathways beyond, the things that are in the domain of city government, like, the spending that the city has or the regulatory powers. There are a variety of different actions and policies, and there's additional spending, obviously, that we rely on the private sector to put forth to help implement the plan. And so, just as it's important to incorporate a broad cross section of the community in the engagement process to help in the plan making, involving that group, that broad cross section of stakeholders in plan doing is just as important.
How does that resonate with you, Evelyn? And as you're working through the update for the Imagine Austin comprehensive plan, does that feel right? Does that feel important?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think the plan doing part, especially when reading your book, like really, really stood out to me. One thing that we did just recently established and kicked off our first meeting, we have through an application process, an extensive application process, we're able to identify 45 community working group members that will be with us over the next year to help give feedback and input with different deliverables and concepts throughout the update process. And these working group members represent a number of different kind of stakeholder groups, whether they're kind of community activists or business owners or students, and to your part of the process. So there's
Yeah.
a lot of different stakeholder groups, which I think kind of supports to your point, John, of not just thinking of the traditional approach of planning, the planning department kind of owning the implementation component or even the development of the plan, but reaching out to different entities that really help support not just the development, but the implementation after the plan's been adopted.
The idea that it's not uh, like sitting in a binder on a shelf after adoption. We reached council adoption and we're done, and it's now it lives on a shelf or it's a PDF in a folder somewhere.
Yeah.
And great, now we're done. We have a comprehensive plan. But John's point is that like that's in some way the beginning of the process. Is that right, John? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. The adoption of the plan should be the beginning of a continuous planning process. And I just want to reflect back on, there's a lot to like about the priority programs approach that you've taken. You talked about several things, Evelyn, in your explanation that I think it's important for your listeners to understand, how successful that can be for that approach can be for your comprehensive plan. We talk about, of course, that it's an important feedback mechanism carrying that through from plan to implementation, then to update. But you're also building implementation accountability into your goals framework, which is I think a really important structural move because a lot of times, what sort of the reason why plans kind of sit on the shelf is they're heavy on vision, they're heavy on goals, and they may have some very aspirational sounding policies that are attached to those goals, but they're not as action oriented as they should be in order to build in the structure of how implementation happens. And so the way that you're approaching priority programs helps to solve that. And then the third thing too that I like about it is, already, in this discussion, we've talked about so many different stakeholders who have a role in implementing a comprehensive plan. Just in your description, Peter and Evelyn, of who all's involved in the priority programs framework, and you listed off a dozen or more different agencies that you have in your city. And then in addition to that, you have the business owners, the developers, the community advocates, all the different stakeholders that we've talked about. So there's within any city a real and significant amount of fragmentation of planning and implementation authority that's just baked into how government is structured, communities are structured, public and private, the roles of public and private sectors are structured, and the priority programs approach that you've taken and thinking about implementation through that lens, I think helps you to solve some of that fragmentation so that it's not you, the planner, are not putting yourselves in the impossible task of being able to control implementation, but more to be in sort of a role of a conductor, where you're bringing all the different members of the orchestra together, and sort of putting the music in front of all of them, and they all understand their parts in order to to get to the symphony that you're creating.
And
Uh,
enabling members to play their parts.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's one other kind of continuation of the priority programs, which Peter, you and I were talking about this, but I'd love to hear, John, kind of what your thoughts are. Um, so kind of thinking more past, so we have the priorities as an organizational structure for the comp plan, and then the priority programs with this update will be an implementation component. For implementation, we're really thinking about looking at these other kind of long range system citywide plans that are already established, as supporting implementation and kind of connecting one or two or a few of them under each kind of priority program. So for example, with housing affordability, if that's the priority that we keep, kind of attaching the strategic housing blueprint as a supporting implementation component. They have identified policies and action items. They have relationships that are already built with other external entities. So, kind of leveraging those relationships, which I think really does support this kind of continuous planning and planning with not just internal stakeholders, but external
Yeah.
groups.
And Imagine Austin
well.
doesn't have to play that role because we already have the strategic housing blueprint to call out those goals and those metrics that how we will implement the vision of Imagine Austin.
Yeah, and we'll still have like high level policies and some actions. We're still trying to figure that out, that are kind of guiding policies that may help inform the update to these other long range plans whenever they do that update, but to kind of help guide that. But just thought of that as another example of kind of continuous change and getting different, I feel like using the word stakeholders a lot, but different important groups involved. But would love to hear your thoughts on kind of that approach.
Yeah, in the book, I talk about that there are 6 implementation pathways that comprehensive plan can use. And of course, as a planner, my favorite implementation pathway is more planning. But you're absolutely right. The comprehensive plan is not intended to, as I talk about, say in the book, it's not intended for completeness. And one of the dimensions of that is, it certainly cannot reach to the level of detail that a lot of sort of system or component plans, like an affordable housing blueprint, would need to reach to in order to address whatever the acute housing issues are, not just across Austin, but in specific areas of Austin. So the role of continuous planning is very important, as a part of that. The periods between the formal planning moments of the comprehensive plan. Imagine Austin is the foundation, of your planning framework, and then building on the foundation, you have many of those component and system plans like the housing plan. But just like any other implementation pathway, um, the comprehensive plan needs to shape those plans, but those plans also sort of loop back and shape what you know about your comprehensive plan. And so those are very important components, because those are just as important moments as um, um, maybe a regulatory change or an investment. Understanding the impact of those implementation pathways, just as you would understand um, an issue in your community at a greater level of detail through a system or component plan, to be able to evaluate how effective was the comprehensive plan that's setting the foundation or the framework for that particular element. So it's a very important component of what you're doing, but it has to be thought of together, and it has to be thought of as as you're doing those component plans, the vision, the strategy that they're aspiring to achieve is the same vision and strategy that's laid out in the comprehensive plan, that's laid out in Imagine Austin.
Yeah, so I think, would you say that it kind of supports that feedback, iterative, kind of component of adaptive planning that you talk about in your book? Not necessarily maybe a feedback loop, but kind of having these long range plans circle back to shape, Imagine
Cer-
Austin.
Certainly, it's probably one of the clearest and most direct ways to be able to source feedback through the implementation process. Because that continuous loop of planning, it helps you just understand the issues better. It helps you understand, sort of changing dynamics better. There's one of the I think one of the things that traditional planning gets wrong, in my view, is the attempt to try to project out, 10, 20, 30, 50 years of, things like population, housing needs, and um, while certainly you need to have a general sense of where your city's headed in order to create a plan to get there. Um, Simply relying on long range forecasted data um, for such long periods of time without continuous inquiry into how your city is changing on a daily basis um, uh, does not make for a really good, robust, and dynamic comprehensive plan. And so the continuous planning function, particularly using those system or component plans, really helps to sort of feed back a lot of that ongoing data and information about how your city is changing daily.
Yeah, keeps you honest, serves as a status check for these long range visions. Something you were saying earlier, John, resonates. You were talking about many comprehensive plans are vision oriented or goal oriented as opposed to action oriented. Part of our engagement process for the update to Imagine Austin is to look at the original vision statement that was part of the original plan in 2012, and it's kind of lengthy and it's packed full of lofty and worthy sentiments, but it's not very direct or practical or actionable. For Memphis 3.0, you had a very simple vision. It was in our third century, Memphis will build up, not out. Did the clarity and the straightforwardness of that statement, did that help the process of making it actionable and implementable?
Yes, absolutely. But I will say it was not without debate.
Right.
Most vision statements are they're aspirational, and the role of the vision statement is it's appropriate for it to be aspirational. Um, just don't stop there. um, Continue to sort of advance to the strategy of the plan, the thesis of your plan. A lot of plans that do that, they have a thesis of change, but change can't happen the same way for everyone in the city. Change can't happen for every place in the city, um, nor would I expect your community would want that. But you know, sort of taking a step down from the vision is I would say it's important to have a strategy for what your city becomes or what your city focuses on, and that may create debate. So in our case, the reason why it was so important that we cast our vision around building it up, not out, was because Memphis for um, in the 1st and 2nd century, but especially the second half of the 2nd century, its growth strategy was outward growth. Memphis grew to over 300 square miles and only stabilized its population because of outward growth. From the period of 1970 to 2020, the physical size of Memphis grew by over 50%. The population stayed flat. And the result of that was 50% more roads, 50% more sewer lines, 50% more area to serve with police and fire and solid waste services, with no new revenue comparatively. And so you can imagine what happens in a situation like that. The resources becomes more strained and more strained year after year after year, as not only we're taking in more area with no new population, but the maintenance responsibilities that start to stack up across a land area like that gets more and more stretched. So we really didn't have a choice. We had to focus our growth strategy on building back into our community. The question was where and how much. And so predictably, when we said we'll build up, not out, we got a lot of questions of, well, how far up are we talking? And where do you want this up to go? So that created a lot of debate and a lot of sort of conflict and struggle because, again, like I said before, we're planning for a developed city. And that notion of density, that notion of what up meant in order to not just sustain our city, but create a thriving city, certainly created some tension in a lot of areas, especially where the infrastructure was most suited to take on more density, whether that be, more walkable street patterns, whether that be, where we had our most active transit service, where we have sewer capacity or, electrical capacity to be able to support more dense development. And so it certainly, that clarity and straightforwardness helped sort of shape the debate and helped shape the discussion around the conflict. Whether it helped overall, it probably would have been easier to just come up with a rosy aspirational statement. But it wouldn't have given us the direction that the plan requires, not just for the policies and the other implementation pathways that need to be written into the plan, but the direction that the plan requires in terms of how it's put to use every day after it's adopted. And so, there's a lot more to the vision statement. And certainly there's a lot more to the plan itself. But I will say this: as far as comprehensive plan vision statements go, it was very memorable, and there were a lot of very casual observers of the planning process while we were doing it and in the time after, that if all they remembered was build up, not out, they remembered something about the plan, and more specifically, they remembered the plan's strategy and knew what the city was trying to accomplish with the comprehensive plan, which is probably one of the most important things that your plan can have.
And that direction that we're headed, we're aiming for, that sort of thing. Because Evelyn, like in the engagement we've done so far, we have heard a lot of that. It was just like this vision statement is kind of vague, it's kind of fuzzy, it sounds nice, but what does it mean and how do we make that happen? And so that simple, direct, Memphis will build up, not out, it's got to be appealing to you.
Yeah, yeah. So we've done kind of two outreach and engagement methods. For the vision statement, we released a survey, so we're in the process of finalizing the data for that. And then we also, in our first community working group meeting, had the working group members break out into small groups, gave them a couple of kind of thought questions about the vision statement and a lot of what we've heard within the community working group, and then also in the survey data. Not to repeat what you said already, but do you understand the vision statement? And yes, these words are understandable, but they're not context specific. So, like, what do the words affordability, accessibility, and sustainability really mean within the context of Austin? The two aspirational feedback we received also, how do we make it more action oriented? And then just kind of connecting it to previous conversations that we've had. How do we ensure that we are not just incorporating into the vision statement, uh, you know, new people that will come to this city, people that will be born into this city, like kind of referencing this kind of migration growth that Lila Valencia, the city demographer, talks about in her Delphi Trends and Imagine Austin assessment. But how do we also plan for these residents that are from Austin, have been here for a long time, as well as planning for new residents. So that was something that was talked about in the working group members. It's a lot to consider and put into a vision statement, but I think figuring out how to do that in a meaningful um, way, but also that a way is direction and action oriented that helps kind of filter into the structure of the plan and then filters down into implementation post adoption.
Yeah. Okay. I think we've hit the end of our conversation, but thank you very much, Evelyn. John, thanks again. Can you mention the name of your book and how we might purchase it?
Thank you. Yeah, the book is Today's Comprehensive Plan and Adaptive Approach. It's available through the publisher, Princeton University Press. It's also available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any other major retailer
Okay.
that you may buy your books from.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, John, for joining us. Evelyn, thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. Thanks, John. It's great to see you. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thank you all.
Absolutely.